Episode 111, Susan's Advice. Jacob dashed out of the stadium and saw the vortex. It was a very hot day, and there was not even a single cloud in the bright, clear sky. However, layers after layers of clouds rose in the skies above the campus all of a sudden. It was only the advancement of the spirit concentration scroll from the second level to the third level, but it had already created a tremendous phenomenon. Who knows what would happen if there was a tribulation? Jacob suppressed the heated blood in his body as he sprinted. He needed to find somewhere quiet to level up, and there was only one place he could think of. He dashed into the administrative building and ran upstairs to Susan's office. He didn't bother to knock because, unlike Liam, Susan was always in her office. He simply pushed the door open and went inside. Susan wasn't surprised to see Jacob come in. She looked at the sky and flipped her fingers. The clouds immediately dispersed. She waved again, and the door behind Jacob automatically closed. Jacob had no time to greet her. He sat down at his usual spot and started his cultivation. Susan raised both hands and put 2 layers of purple light spheres around Jacob as a protective barrier. Jacob breathed deeply and continued doing so for half an hour. Once he was sure, he opened his eyes and said to Susan, "I'm on the 3rd level." Susan nodded lightly as she took the protection barriers back without a word. Jacob thought Susan was upset because of the way he barged in, so he explained, "I didn't mean to intrude. It's just that I suddenly felt like I was about to break through, and there was nowhere else to go, so—" Susan waved her hand to stop him. Because of her trained, emotionless face, Jacob couldn't analyze what Susan was thinking. He stood up and said, "Sorry to disturb you. This will count towards my practice for today, so I won't be coming again after 4. He examined his body and felt the nature essence filling up every single part of his body. It made him feel really comfortable. He could guide the essence flow and transfer it out of his body now. It meant that he was now on the 3rd level of the spirit concentration scroll. It seemed like breaking through the spirit concentration scroll wasn't as difficult as Jacob had imagined. It all depended on luck and timing. However, hard work and dedication definitely helped. Jacob felt relaxed and less stressed out now that he had reached the 3rd level. It shouldn't be a problem getting to the 1st level after solidifying the 3rd level of the spirit concentration scroll and cultivating another technique. It shouldn't be hard to get started as long as my foundation is well built, he thought. He got to the door and suddenly sensed an intense pain in his head, as if he had walked straight into an iron board. The sharp pain made him stumble backwards. He turned around to look at Susan, and he saw her pointing at the mat that he was sitting on. He was bewildered for a few seconds, and then suddenly remembered something. His face turned green as he recalled that the real ordeal was to follow. He recalled the excruciating pain he had to go through after getting to the 2nd level, and right now, it seemed the pain was going to get worse with each level he passed. A heated flame rose up from his body. All the acupoints in his body started burning. It felt even worse than being set on fire. Jacob dashed to his mat in a hurry and sat on his legs and used the spirit concentration scroll to suppress the pain. He almost forgot about the torment of rebirth after the thrill of the breakthrough. Each acupoint in his body was like a miniature explosive device. Nature essence kept gathering, expanding, and exploding in his acupoints, and it made it extremely hard for Jacob to endure. Jacob couldn't even maintain his sitting position after a few minutes. He was in too much pain to care about how he was appearing in front of Susan. He laid straight down on the chair with his body bent and his fists clenched. It was an unimaginable pain. He felt as if hundreds of needles were drilling hard into his whole body at the same time. His clothes were soaked in sweat, and even the chair got stained. Susan opened up her drawer calmly and took out a bottle of spherical pills. Then she flipped it over to Jacob. "What's this?" Jacob asked, gritting his teeth. "It's a pill that can release you from the pain," Susan said simply. As Jacob was reaching for it, she added, "This pill may reduce the pain, but at the same time, it will end the self-building process earlier and harm your potential. Of course, this won't be a problem as long as you're not looking to get to a much higher level. Jacob was almost passing out from the acute pain. However, he heard Susan's words and thought about it. Then he put the bottle back on the desk, pushing it further away from him. Susan was a little surprised by Jacob's behavior, as she didn't know if she should be admiring him or laughing at his cockiness. He definitely has the fire. He really wants to get to the higher levels, she thought. She had to admit that he had advanced to the 3rd level of the Spirit Concentration Scroll at an impressive speed. However, that was under the patient guidance and great help of many masters. Does he think that all the levels are going to be as easy? Susan thought. It would be a miracle for Jacob's human body to reach the 4th level, and the clan's expectation from him was reaching the 2nd level. It would be a happy ending if he could share half of the dragon core with Sophie to save her life. Jacob suddenly turned over on the chair when Susan was thinking aloud to herself. Jacob's entire body straightened up and huge drops of sweat kept falling off of his forehead. "Don't play tough anymore and take the pill," Susan persuaded him after seeing how hard it was for him to fight the pain. She didn't know if he was stubborn or stupid. Jacob shook his head and kept gritting his teeth. The blue veins popped up on his arms and the chair trembled under his grip. Susan closed her eyes to disregard Jacob's suffering. She chanted in her head, "Out of sight, out of mind." Half an hour later, Jacob let out a long exhale. Sweat covered his entire head. He said to Susan across the table, "It is done, Susan." She opened her eyes and stretched her palms. The bottle of pills flew back into her hands, and she put it back in her drawer without a word. "The levels to follow are going to be more and more difficult. Right now, it's just painful, but in the future, never mind, I believe Dracon won't let you suffer." Susan pushed the hair behind her ear and said, "I was cultivating a technique and blocked my 6 senses when you came in. I wasn't able to speak after you interrupted me. It was not that I didn't want to talk to you." Jacob nodded. He knew her personality, and it was already difficult for Susan to explain herself to anyone. He felt guilty for rushing into her office all of a sudden, which could have caused her trouble during her cultivation. "There are invisible barriers around my office, but you can easily get past them since you have that necklace. I'll let it go this time. Unless there is an emergency, please don't come into my office outside of our scheduled time," Susan continued. "Sure," Jacob nodded. Susan didn't seem kind, but she was pretty nice to him. Jacob was clear about that. It may be only because of Sophie and her parents, but it sure did Jacob a huge favor and helped him cultivate faster. "One more thing. Since you are now on the 3rd level of the Spirit Concentration Scroll, there is something I need to remind you of," Susan said to him. "Dracon will probably take you to the Dragon Palace to pick a technique. If you really wish to cultivate in the long run, you should look for those that are good at foundation building and leveling up. It wouldn't be the best idea to pick the ones that are powerful early on and meant for fighting. After all, fighting and battling earlier on won't be beneficial in the long run." Episode 112, Mystic Crystals. "Thanks for the reminder." Jacob nodded before standing up to leave Susan's office. Susan may have looked cold and aloof, but she was very helpful with techniques and guidance. These acts only demonstrated her passion and dedication to cultivation. Jacob now felt like he was back to the 1st level of the Spirit Concentration Scroll with the boundless nature essence running through his body. The difference was that the nature essence now was controlled by his thoughts, and he could store it in his body or push it out. Seeing Jacob getting ready to leave, Susan said suddenly, "There is something else." Jacob stopped and wondered why Susan was so talkative today. She generally just ignored him and concentrated on her own cultivation. "There is one important thing." Susan stared at Jacob and said, "The Spirit Concentration Scroll can only toughen your body. Only after you enter the first level can you be called a real cultivator. You swallowed Soph's dragon core, which is a natural treasure for the dragons that could assist with your cultivation, but you need to find a mystic crystal to match your dragon core to keep your nature essence together. The grade of the mystic crystal will determine the potential of your future cultivations. Mystic crystals? Jacob was baffled since he had never heard of this before. Susan said, earnestly, "If the third level is the highest you want to achieve, the mystic crystal doesn't mean anything to you. They didn't inject a mystic crystal into Soph, and she didn't work hard. Thus, her cultivation realm is not solid. All her achievements in cultivation were the result of the elixirs that the palace had. If you had swallowed a mature dragon's core, you, a mortal being, would have been dead long ago. The elders were too afraid to tell the truth to Drakon. They simply attributed the weakness of Soph's dragon core to her young age. The real reason Soph's dragon core was weak was that her cultivation was bad." Jacob nodded and waited for her to continue. Susan wasn't a big talker, but whatever she said was valuable. He already knew that Sophie wasn't a pro cultivator. She only cultivated the amount that was necessary to keep her going. He had learned from General Arthur that Susan had been an awe-inspiring master since she was 15. Susan proved his words that age had nothing to do with the maturity of the dragon core. Those elders were afraid to point out the fact that Soph was a lazy cultivator and concealed the truth with vague references to her age. "I appreciate your fast cultivation progress and your ability to suppress the aggressiveness of the dragon core. However, your current speed may not be sustainable. It would be extremely difficult to break through at each level in the future. The good news is that Soph's immature dragon core matches your progress from 0, Susan continued. Jacob listened attentively to her. As an inspector of the dragon tribe, Susan was fair and honest. "Now, about that mystic crystal. This clan's expectation for you is the 2nd level. That's why I think Drakon won't approve of injecting a mystic crystal into you. Apart from the danger, the acquisition of the mystic crystal would be difficult. Even in this clan, where countless treasures are collected, it is hard to find natural treasures that can be made into a mystic crystal." "A treasure so rare that even a rich clan like ours doesn't have it?" Jacob thought. A thought suddenly occurred to him, and he asked, "Susan, what does your mystic crystal look like?" At this, Susan rolled her eyes and answered, "The mystic crystal is a personal secret, and I will never reveal it to you. But I can tell you that I only got it after risking my life." Jacob looked at Susan in admiration. He knew that she was telling the truth, as he believed that Susan was the kind of person who would do anything to elevate her cultivation realm. "What does a mystic crystal look like?" Jacob asked again. At Jacob's insistence, Susan hesitated and answered, after a moment of consideration, "The mystic crystals don't have a fixed shape. In your case, you will have a pure water body type, so you need to find objects made of pure water elements. For example, the purple crystal gel, 7-heart coral, Kirin scale, etc. If you can't get them, at least you must find the West Ocean mystic ice." Jacob had never heard of the items Susan had just mentioned, but he forced himself to memorize them. He knew he would need a water elemental mystic crystal since he would develop in the direction of a pure water body type. Then, he thought back to all the information he had gathered today. He remembered that, according to General Arthur, Susan had the metal water body type, and that was why she could cultivate at an unusually fast speed. However, it also brought the difficult problem of finding a mystic crystal that could fit her. No wonder she only got the satisfactory mystic crystal at the risk of her life. After seeing Jacob's expectant expression, Susan froze for a moment before saying, "That's all." "Oh, okay." Jacob relaxed and silently reviewed what Susan had told him. He said, "Susan, thank you for teaching me this. Now, I have to go. I have class soon." Susan just nodded and picked up a textbook and some notes from her desk. At that moment, Jacob suddenly remembered that the upcoming class was actually Susan's class. Not wanting to go to the classroom together with her, Jacob left Susan's office first. Gathering his thoughts, he went out to find Sam and his other 2 roommates. Standing at the door, Susan watched Jacob leave and thought, "What's wrong with me today? Why did I tell him those things? Do I really expect him to reach the higher levels with his shabby and chaotic 5-elemental mortal body? But the kid has grit. He could bear the excruciating pain and even refuse to take the pill to relieve the pain. It's more painful for his chaotic 5-elemental mortal body type to transform into a better body type. It will be a tough task to bear such pains. Maybe he will reach a higher realm than expected," she mused. Susan knew she had to help Jacob get to the higher levels to save Sophie's life. Smoothing the hair on her forehead, Susan shut the office door behind her and walked toward the stairs. Outside the building, Jacob called Sam and asked, "Where are you?"
"In the classroom. Where have you been? Do you really want to miss Susan's class? We've saved a seat for you. Come soon."
Sam yelled into the phone.
Coming,
he replied hastily. Despite being tired from bearing excruciating pain, Jacob didn't dare miss Susan's class. Susan was called the Icy Beauty not only because she never smiled, but also because she was extremely strict with her class. It had the highest number of failed students each term. Although Jacob was sort of friends with her in private, he didn't think Susan would be lenient towards him in class. When he rushed into the classroom, Sam stood up and beckoned at him. Here! Jacob walked towards his friends, who were all seated in the last row as usual. They were all looking rather fresh. It was Susan's class, after all. Otherwise, half of the boys literally just attended classes for the attendance and slept off halfway through. As soon as he said that, his friends found something out of place. Most of them didn't think much of it and focused on the door that Susan would enter any minute. But Sam leaned to one side and looked at Jacob from top to bottom. He was puzzled and thought, "How come Jacob looks more handsome than before all of a sudden? What is his secret? How is he getting more and more dashing these days? Is puberty being kind to him?" Jacob ignored him and turned to look at the girls who sat in the front row. Kathy was one of them. The moment Jacob looked at her, Kathy also looked at him. She had to do a double check just to make sure that it was Jacob she was looking at. She shivered a little in confusion. Is he really Jacob? How come he looks so different now? Episode 113. Dinner with Susan. As the bell rang, Susan walked into the classroom. Everyone immediately sat up straight. They were scared of being caught slacking in her class. The 2-hour class seemed to pass in the blink of an eye. Everyone was silent, either concentrating on the chapter or Susan. One of Jacob's friends suddenly got an idea and leaned his face toward Jacob and said, "My dear Jacob, since you are close to Susan, why not ask her out for dinner? Maybe you could introduce us to her." Dinner? Jacob thought for a moment. "Do you know any good restaurants around here?" he asked, just to humor his friend. "Of course. Alex's Kitchen is a new restaurant on the second floor of the food court. It is multi-cuisine and the environment is great, though it is a bit expensive," his friend answered. Jacob nodded, wondering if he should really invite Susan to dinner. After all, she had helped him a lot, and he hadn't had a chance to show his gratitude. "Are you going to invite Susan to dinner?" Sam joined the conversation. Jacob waved his hand and said, "I don't know. I was just curious." Susan was immortal, and treating her to a simple meal would be beneath her. However, if he gave her a gift, it would look like bribery. Jacob weighed his options while walking out of the classroom. "We have no class this afternoon. I'm heading to the stadium to practice," Sam said as he handed his books to Jacob. "Damn it, you are becoming crazier about basketball day by day," Ryan yelled after Sam, who had already dashed away. After returning to the dorm, some students took naps while others began to play games. After a moment of consideration, Jacob took out his cell phone and sent a text message to Susan. I'd like to invite you to dinner tonight to celebrate my breakthrough to the 3rd level of the Spirit Concentration Scroll and to show my gratitude for your tutoring. What do you think of Alec's Kitchen at the food court?" With a palpitating heart, Jacob sent the message. He kept it as formal as he could so she wouldn't take it the wrong way. He didn't expect Susan to reply. At least he showed his gratitude with this message. To his surprise, Susan answered the message a couple of minutes later. "Okay, when?" was her simple reply. Jacob really hadn't thought it through. He didn't think Susan would waste her time on dinner with him, so he didn't plan anything after the text. He fumbled to send a reply. "How about 7 o'clock tonight? We can meet directly at Alec's Kitchen." "Okay," Susan replied to his message. Jacob heaved a sigh of relief. Tossing the phone aside, he collapsed in his bed. A thought occurred to him, and he picked up his cell phone and messaged Sophie. "I'm having dinner with Susan tonight. Will you join us?" "I wish. Got lots of homework today," Sophie replied immediately with a sad emoticon. Jacob sighed. He thought having Sophie there would really cut out some of the tension and give them more things to talk about. He texted back, "I did not think this through." Sophie replied back with a laughing emoticon and wrote, "All the best." He thought back to his day so far and recalled all the weird looks he got after his breakthrough, including Kathy's. To think of it, it feels quite good after breaking through the 3rd level of the Spirit Concentration Scroll. He tried to circulate the nature essence in his body and released it on the curtain on the sliding door to the balcony. The curtain swayed as if someone was pulling at it. Jacob was ecstatic. He wasn't even on the 1st level yet, and he already had such power. He could only imagine the things he would be able to do after he got to the 1st level. "Jacob, what are you chuckling about? Come here and watch this film with us." His roommate stood at the door of the room and asked Jacob. "You guys carry on. I'm a little sleepy." Jacob turned to the wall and yawned to add effect. He was feeling really good today and was in no mood to waste his time watching a film. "Oh, okay. By the way, are you really going out with Kathy? I saw the way you two were sharing those little glances," he asked again. Hearing the question, Jacob sighed. He was a little tired of answering the same question day after day. "No, you're imagining things. She's just helping me with basketball," Jacob answered lazily. Jacob sometimes questioned his relationship with Kathy. At first, he wasn't sure what she felt about him, but the more time you spend with someone, the more you get to know them. Kathy was good to everyone in the class, but she had never gotten too close to any of the guys. After spending some time with her, Jacob found her to be a sincere and straightforward girl. "I think I have become one of her good friends without knowing it. She's a very helpful and kind person. It's good that she's my friend," Jacob thought with a smile. Jacob started getting bored after he had refused to watch the movie, so he picked up his cell phone and thought of texting Sophie. But then he decided against it when he reread her last text. She must be busy at the moment. Bored, Jacob went to sleep and didn't wake up until the evening. Seeing the time drawing near, Jacob put on his shoes and got ready to go out. Ignoring the boys in the dorm, he hurried to the food court. The moment he entered the food court, his cell phone beeped with Susan's text. "Left corner." She sensed my arrival. Jacob was impressed, and he climbed up the stairs to get to the restaurant. He pushed the door open and went in. As he walked in, he took in the atmosphere of the place. It was very somber and poised. He felt a little out of place there since he was not used to going to such expensive places with his friends. Susan was already inside waiting for him. She nodded toward the seat across from her, and Jacob walked over and sat down uneasily. After all, it was the first time he was about to have a meal with Susan. She was looking beautiful as usual, and everyone was looking at her sneakily. Jacob considered for a moment whether he should compliment her, but then decided against it. Susan was intimidating enough as it was, so he didn't need to make her mad by saying something inappropriate. "The dinner is on me to celebrate your breakthrough," Susan said as a waitress approached them to take their order. After placing their orders, Jacob insisted, "The dinner is on me." Susan didn't argue. Instead, she asked, "Have you been getting close with Kathy recently?" Kathy was an excellent student and one of the few girls in the engineering class. Susan naturally knew her. "I'm preparing for a basketball match next week. She's my basketball coach," he answered simply. "Okay." Susan didn't pursue the topic. Instead, she asked him another question. "The last time you visited the Dragon Palace, you asked to release 2 sisters from the Cold Palace, right?" "Yeah, is something wrong?" Jacob asked. He had almost forgotten about it, and now he was a bit nervous since Susan, an inspector, mentioned it. "General Arthur sent a message to the above realm but received no reply. So he released them," Susan said. "Oh, okay," Jacob nodded, thinking about the sisters. "Do you realize what you have done?" Susan continued to ask. "What have I done?" Jacob was confused. "They were released from the Cold Palace. Since Dragon Palace is not their home and they can't return to the above realm, where do you think they will go?" Susan asked. Jacob was even more confused. "Where will they go?" Susan sighed in exasperation. "To you." "To me?" Jacob almost dropped the glass of water in his hand. Susan glanced at him and said, "Liam is handling it. He has arranged for them to temporarily live at his place. So, in the future, you must think twice before making any decisions." "But we can't lock them up forever. Also, General Arthur said that they hadn't committed any serious crimes," Jacob argued. "Sometimes good intentions bring bad results," Susan lectured. "It seems like Susan is not here to have dinner. She just wants to question me in a different place," Jacob mused to himself sulkily. "Do you even know what cultivation level they are on?" Susan asked him abruptly. Episode 114, The Show-Off. Jacob thought Susan was asking too many questions today. It felt like she was interrogating him. However, he didn't want to offend her, so he guessed. The 5th level? He thought no matter how powerful the 2 immortal maids were, they couldn't be that impressive. They were maids, after all. 7th, Susan said, with a straight face. Jacob was shocked and had to take a few moments to think about where the 7th level stood. Elder Liam was at the 7th level, but Jacob had never seen him cast a spell. He saw the power of the 4th level elder summoning rain the last time he was at Sophie's house. When that elder raised his hand, he was able to flip the clouds over and create rain. Imagine what a 7th level master was capable of. Those 2 girls who looked a lot younger than Susan are at the 7th level. It's so unbelievable, Jacob wondered to himself. 2 7th level masters want to return your favor and work for you. If they are together, even I can't fight against them. Susan finally expressed her concern. Susan is actually worried about this. Jacob laughed on the inside. It was hard to imagine the all-powerful, almighty Susan feeling helpless. He thought about why Susan was so concerned about his situation, and then he realized Susan had no authority over those 2 girls because she was only responsible for supervising the dragon tribe's internal affairs, and those 2 girls weren't a part of the dragon tribe. Having 2 7th level masters as my bodyguards, Susan would definitely have a headache about this. Jacob couldn't help but laugh when he thought of this. It seemed like she sensed Jacob's change of mood and said, "Don't be pleased yet.
It's hard to tell whether it's a good thing or a bad thing to have them serve you."
She stared at Jacob and continued,
"You could mess things up even when you have good intentions. They could also mess things up with their good intentions. Besides,"
Susan dragged out her voice and said slowly,
"their destructive power is much stronger than yours."
With that coming from Susan, Jacob's excitement suddenly vanished and a chill took its place. He couldn't imagine how much destruction 2 7th-level cultivators could cause if they got annoyed or angered in any way.
"My responsibility is to maintain the affairs of the dragon tribe in this region, and you're also under my surveillance. If they behave well, nothing will happen. If they cause trouble, I won't hesitate to stop them,"
Susan said indifferently. Her strong aura reflected the power of a master. An 8th-level master versus 2 7th-level masters? Jacob imagined it and immediately felt a chill run down his spine. At that moment, the door was pushed open and 2 servers walked in with plates in their hands. A few delicious dishes were placed in front of Jacob and Susan, and the atmosphere became a bit lighter. Once the servers left the room, Jacob asked, "So, are those 2 maids on the same level as Elder Liam?"
"Liam is in the low tier of the 7th level, and both of them are in the top tier. Who do you think is stronger?"
Susan asked Jacob. Jacob blanked out. "Are you in the top tier or low tier of 8th level?"
"Mid-tier,"
Susan replied proudly. Jacob knew that he had already annoyed Susan, so one more question wouldn't hurt. He continued to ask, "Is Soph's third uncle in the top tier or low tier?"
"He's a master who's 1 step away from advancing into a heavenly dragon. Of course, he's in the top tier,"
Susan replied. Jacob compared them in his mind. 2 Liams couldn't defeat 1 Susan, and 2 Susans couldn't beat 1 Kenneth. Even if those 2 girls worked together, they would be no match for Kenneth. Soph's third uncle is really a strong dragon. Susan could almost hear the gears turning in Jacob's head, so she asked,
"Anything else you want to ask me?"
Jacob shook his head in embarrassment. "Nothing else."
"Okay."
Susan lowered her head. She began to focus on her food. Once they started to eat, both of them didn't talk at all. Susan tasted the dishes slowly, and Jacob secretly enjoyed the calm atmosphere. She probably doesn't eat at restaurants that often. Since she's an inspector, everybody respects her. In real life, she probably doesn't have many friends because of her cold personality and her persistence towards cultivation, Jacob thought. He didn't think much about the maids, who were apparently going to serve him now. He thought that 2 7th-level cultivators would surely find something better to do with their time than serve a mere human. After they finished eating a quiet dinner, Jacob and Susan walked out of the dining area together and went to pay at the front desk. When Jacob took out his card, he looked at Susan to see if she still insisted on paying. However, Susan didn't move at all. Jacob used his card to pay the bill and walked out of the restaurant.
"I'll give you a treat next time. I wanted to treat you today, but I realized that I didn't bring my wallet," said Susan. If any other guy from their college got this invitation, he would definitely jump up in excitement. However, Jacob had been tricked twice by Susan, and he won't accept her invitations so casually. "Oh, that's not necessary. Tonight was my idea, and I did want to give you a treat," Jacob said as he climbed down the stairs. He saw that Susan kept standing at the entrance of Alec's kitchen and asked, "Aren't you going back?" "Never mind. There are a lot of students down there. I won't cause you any more trouble." Susan shook her head, turned into a white shadow, and vanished. She is indeed a master. When can I reach this level of stealth? Jacob sighed and continued to climb down the stairs. Suddenly, a white light flashed, and Susan suddenly appeared beside Jacob again. Jacob was shocked by her sudden reappearance. "God, I know that you're skillful, but you didn't have to scare me," he said. He kept a hand on his chest to feel his heart racing from the jump scare. "I'm not trying to scare you. I saw your opponent approaching you, so I will return the favor right now." Susan hung on to Jacob's arm and walked down the stairs slowly with him. "Opponent?" Jacob was a bit confused. "What opponent do I have?" When he and Susan walked down from the second floor of the food court, Jacob saw Michael, who was not far away, bringing a group of friends there to eat. He understood Susan's intention, but didn't know why she was helping him with such a petty matter, or how she even knew about the fact that their fight had something to do with her. This guy must be loaded with money. He brings people to eat out every night, Jacob thought while looking at Michael, who was laughing with a huge group of people. Michael, who was nearby, also saw Susan and Jacob on the stairs, and it caught him off guard. Susan, who was in a beautiful evening dress and had her hair tied into a low bun, looked fabulous, and the curved staircase was like a natural stage that allowed everyone to look at her. Michael, who was walking proudly while surrounded by a large group of friends, suddenly turned pale when he saw Susan and Jacob walking down from the second floor. Susan leaned against Jacob as she walked down, step by step. Then they began walking in the direction of the university. When he passed by Michael, Jacob could clearly hear the sound of Michael grinding his teeth. As soon as they walked away from the restaurant in front of everyone and entered a blind spot, Susan immediately took her hand back and said, "Let's call it a night." And just like that, she disappeared again. Looking at the spot where she had disappeared, Jacob shook his head and thought to himself, "Susan is so unpredictable at times." He sighed and walked back to his dorm while thinking about the consequences of the very public appearance Susan and he had just made. Michael would definitely stir up some drama to get his revenge. Episode 115, Unexpected Invitation. Jacob returned to the dorm and found that his roommates were watching another movie. It seemed like they were doing a marathon, and some of the guys from the other rooms had also joined in. Sam hadn't returned from his basketball practice and was probably still at the stadium. People usually forget their friends when they're in love, but Sam forgot his friends for his favorite sport. Basketball was indeed the first love of his life. Jacob poked one of the guys from another room and asked, "Could you lend me the basketball from your room?" "It's underneath the bed. Go, take it," the guy replied, without looking away from the screen. Jacob went to his room and scooped out the basketball from underneath the bed. He then carried it out of the dorm and went on campus. Just a few minutes after Jacob left, Ryan ran into the room and announced, "Big news, big news. Someone saw Jacob eating dinner with Susan at Alex just now." "What?" Everyone who had their eyes glued to the screen suddenly looked up and shouted at once. Jacob didn't even know what had happened in his absence. He left his cell phone in the room because he didn't want any interruptions. He dribbled the ball as he walked to the basketball court. It felt great to enjoy the quiet campus at night. When he played with Sam and the guys, he didn't get a lot of alone time like this, and he was able to treasure it more now. Jacob felt like his mind and spirit had become entirely different, probably because he had advanced to the third level of the spirit concentration scroll. A soft, cool breeze was making the atmosphere very pleasant. He concentrated on the wind and felt the change in its direction. The feeling of controlling the wind with his mind was exhilarating. If he leveled up to another realm, he would even be able to ride the wind. Jacob continued to dribble the basketball till he reached the court. He selected a basketball stand and started practicing passing with the assistance of the backboard. It was already past 10 in the night. Since the curfew was 11 o'clock, the students who were playing basketball had returned by now. Jacob was the only person playing on the whole basketball court, and he maintained the correct posture and passed against the backboard. His accuracy was getting better each time. He counted until 300 and felt like his arms were slightly sore. Then he started practicing dribbling. Throughout the advancement of his realm, Susan's bracelets seemed to increase in weight as well. Jacob roughly estimated that each bracelet was now 100 pounds each, which was double the original weight. He dribbled in laps around the stand for a while and then began practicing shooting. Jacob continued to recall the techniques Kathy had taught him while attempting to maintain proper posture and smooth movements. The basketball hit the backboard and went inside the net. Jacob changed to another position and continued to practice shooting. Occasionally, someone would pass by and it would look like Jacob was just practicing basketball, when, in reality, Jacob was trying to understand the third level of the Spirit Concentration Scroll. Feel the wind, feel the strength, and feel the trajectory of all objects. He couldn't communicate with heaven and earth with the third level of the Spirit Concentration Scroll, but he could sense the energy flow of the surroundings in a radius of 10 meters. The basketball shot out of Jacob's hands and landed inside the net elegantly. Jacob, who learned the standard postures, seemed to have grasped the techniques of basketball, and he was able to use the nature essence pulled in by the Spirit Concentration Scroll. Jacob picked up the ball again and changed to another shooting position. His aim was completely on point. Sam was running along the road on the other side of the basketball court. He ran closer to the court because he saw someone was still practicing this late in the night. When he saw that the person practicing wasn't anyone else but Jacob, he suddenly felt touched. He knew that Jacob was going to play in the game next week for his sake. When he saw Jacob shooting the basketball smoothly with such accuracy, the touchy-feely emotion had suddenly turned into a shock.
How did he do that?
Seeing that Jacob hadn't missed a shot and continued to shoot for the 12th time, Sam was dumbfounded. Jacob picked up the basketball on the court, jumped to warm up, and rushed towards another basket abruptly. The basketball turned into shadows as he dribbled, and Jacob's speed was unbelievable. Jacob suddenly raised the basketball and threw it forward. The ball drew a high parabola, a three-pointer. Sam, who stood outside of the court, suddenly felt like he was falling apart.
Is Kathy a magician? Or is this person not Jacob but his long-lost twin brother?
Jacob felt someone staring at him. He turned around and saw Sam watching him through the wired fence. "Hey, Sam!" Jacob picked up the basketball and greeted him. Sam just wordlessly looked at Jacob as if he was looking at a monster.
This is an illusion. It definitely is. I've been too tired lately. Better return to the dorm early and rest.
Sam's body stiffened, and he continued running forward. Jacob looked at Sam, who was running away, and found it weird. He wondered, don't tell me that Sam has lost his mind from practicing too much basketball. He then picked up the basketball and practiced the layup that Kathy had taught him. Jacob didn't return to the dorm to rest until 10:30. Sam, who was in the room washing and soaking his feet, saw Jacob coming back with the basketball, and he looked at Jacob oddly.
Were you playing basketball on the court?
He asked. Yeah. Jacob rolled the basketball underneath Sam's bed and replied, I saw you passing by. I called you, but you didn't answer. Sam looked at Jacob with an even odder glance, thought for a while, and said,
Come to join the basketball team officially, Jacob.
What? No, I'm not into basketball. I practiced for fun because I don't want to be a disgrace in next week's game. Jacob grabbed his towel and smiled at Sam. I'll cooperate with you fully and make you a scoring king next week. Seeing Jacob taking the towel out of the room, Sam gazed in the direction of the door and thought,
Jacob is a damn good friend.
On Friday morning, Jacob and Sam woke up at the same time. Sam went to the main entrance of the college to group up with the basketball team for the morning run, and Jacob went to the food court to buy breakfast and went to the basketball court to wait for Kathy. Not long after, Kathy rode her bicycle and brought a basketball to the court. I won't touch the basketball today. I'll see if you have mastered what I have taught you in the past few days." Kathy jumped off of her bicycle and threw the basketball to Jacob. She stood on the side of the court and acted as a coach. "Do 5 layups, 10 shots, and dribble 6 times in and out of the three-point line." She allocated the drills verbally, and Jacob held the basketball and completed them one by one. After 10 minutes, Jacob finished doing the first drill. Kathy nodded in admiration and said, "You've grasped the fundamentals. In next week's game, as long as you don't make mistakes, you will be fine. That'll be all for today." "That's it?" Jacob was surprised. He had had 2 to 3 hours of practice daily in the past few days. "Yeah, you've learned all the basics. I have nothing else to teach you," Kathy replied, as she put the basketball in her bicycle basket. "How about next week?" Jacob asked. "You've got to practice by yourself next week, too. I have already finished what I needed to teach you. There are still some difficult moves and techniques, but there's no need to teach you. You'll just get confused. You only need to know the fundamentals and play your role on the court," Kathy said, as she pushed her bicycle forward. "Guess that's it then." Jacob felt a little sad. Practicing basketball with Kathy every morning felt very pleasant. "I heard that you ate out with Susan at the food court yesterday?" Kathy asked suddenly. "What's wrong?" Jacob asked. "Nothing." Kathy lowered her head slightly before saying, "Oh, and by the way, my brother wants to invite you over for dinner. Would you come?" Episode 116, The Bullies. "Kyle wants me at his place for dinner?" Jacob couldn't process this information. "There's no hostility. It's for you guys to get to know each other better. You will be playing a game together next week. Kyle wants to spend some time to get rid of any old misunderstandings," Kathy said. This invitation came very suddenly for Jacob, but he accepted it anyway. "All right. Let's go together after classes," Jacob thought for a bit and said. "Okay. It's still early, so I'll go study in the classroom. If you want to practice, you can have this ball." Kathy got on her bicycle and said. "Sure," Jacob said, taking out the ball from the basket of her bicycle. "Remember to return the basketball to the stadium after school." Kathy rode her bicycle and left the court. Jacob picked up the basketball and continued practicing. However, the morning practice didn't seem as interesting without Kathy there. After randomly shooting at the net for half an hour, he returned the basketball to the stadium's equipment room and went to class from there. As for Kyle's invitation, Jacob didn't tell anyone else about it. No matter what Kyle's real intention was, he believed that Kathy wouldn't set him up. The morning class was very boring, and Jacob couldn't stand it anymore. Therefore, he decided to text Sophie. Knowing her, he knew she must be getting bored in school as well. "What class are you in right now?" "Calculus." Sophie sent a message right away. "I'm going to go to a classmate's home later tonight and won't be coming to your house," Jacob replied. "As you wish. Mom is cooking salmon today. Now I'll have all of it alone," she teased him. "You wouldn't dare," Jacob replied back playfully. Sophie just sent back the evil grin emoticon for that. "I advanced to the 3rd level of the Spirit Concentration Scroll." Jacob sent her the good news. "That's great. Congratulations," Sophie texted happily. Jacob was about to text back, but at the same time, his professor called out his name, so he kept the phone down. After a few minutes, Sophie's new text message arrived. "I was changing. I have gym now, so I can't text you anymore." With that text, Jacob's class also ended. He didn't have another class until much later, and he wasn't in the mood to go back to the dorm. Just as he was thinking about what to do, an idea struck him. he decided to go to Sophie's school and spend his free time with her. He was sure she would appreciate a break from the monotonous school day. Jacob tossed his books to Sam and told him, "Take my books back to the dorm. I've got some errands to run." Looking at Jacob, who had dashed away from him, Sam yelled indignantly, "What? You think I'm a delivery boy?" But Jacob was already out of earshot. He took a bus to Cherry Grove High School and arrived at the entrance of the school about 10 minutes later. It was not break time yet, and the gate was still locked. Jacob walked into the guard's office and told the guard that he needed to visit Sophie from the senior year. The guard obviously didn't just let him in like that and asked him for an ID. Jacob had no other option than to dig out his student ID card. Seeing the ID card of a reputed university, the guard finally relented. He took Jacob's student ID and reluctantly allowed him into the school, stating that he could only stay for 1 hour. Since his student ID was with the guard, Jacob had to make sure that he did not cause trouble in the school. He was thinking about how to figure out where the gym was when he saw a few students running around on the ground outside the building. He approached the ground and realized that it was his lucky day, as Sophie's gym teacher had decided to conduct the class outside. Standing in a remote corner, Jacob searched for Sophie, but all the girls were dressed in the same white uniform, which made it harder to locate her. Finally, he spotted Sophie among the swarm of students. She looked cute in her white sportswear, and her face wore a bored expression. Jacob was amused as he watched the class progress. He was reminded of his own experience in the gym class. He hated exercising and sports as a kid and was more into reading. The gym was his personal nightmare. He then thought about how far he had come. He is a member of the university basketball team now. This class looked like the students were free to play whatever they pleased, as some played basketball, some played soccer, and some just jogged. Nobody was allowed to sit free, though. Sophie was reluctantly jogging. She was beside her friend, and they were immersed in what looked like a very interesting conversation. Jacob remembered that Sophie's usual uniform was a sky blue suit and skirt, but she had changed into a deep blue shirt and a pair of deep blue pants for the gym class. Jacob noticed some of the guys looking at Sophie and admiring her with a smile. Her advisor was right. Sophie was indeed the prettiest girl in her class and attracted a lot of attention. She, however, was oblivious to all this and had her attention focused only on what her friend was saying. Seeing that some other girls were getting ahead of her, Sophie suddenly turned back to the track and used her dragon strength to finish the lap first. Jacob knew that Sophie was not very athletic, but she was quite competitive. If someone had competed with her in cultivation, she would probably have reached a higher realm long ago. A while later, Sophie's friend also reached the finish line panting. She walked to Sophie and tugged her pigtails playfully for leaving their conversation in between. The two girls messed with each other a little and still hadn't discovered Jacob's arrival. After a while, the teacher gathered all the students together and gave them some instructions. He tossed out a couple of volleyballs and returned to his office to rest. Being a gym teacher was indeed one of the most comfortable jobs in the school. The students picked up the balls and ran to the nearby volleyball court to play. Sophie's friend dragged her along to join the game. During this time, Jacob just stood under the tree on the edge of the ground and amused himself by watching the game. Mostly Sophie. The match began. They decided to play boys versus girls. They played the game in a well-organized way, as their teacher had taught them. Among the girls, Sophie had the quickest reflexes, and she excelled at digging. Since she could always pick up the most difficult serves, she gradually became the main player. Looks like there is one sport that she actually likes, Jacob thought to himself. She jumped up to hit the ball, and it landed in a corner out of the boys' reach. The boys looked around in frustration and began to blame each other. The girls won another point, and they circled around Sophie, cheering. Standing at a distance, Jacob couldn't help but grin at Sophie's excitement. Suddenly, he noticed several guys from another class gathering together and talking. After that, they walked toward the volleyball court. Sophie saw them approaching, but she ignored them. Backing up to the edge of the court, she tossed the ball high in the air and then jumped up for a smashing serve. Seeing those students approaching, the boys in Sophie's class were a bit panicky and didn't pick up the serve. Jacob deduced that they were probably the bullies of the school. The girls got another point, but they didn't cheer. Instead, they uneasily watched the approaching students. With a straight face, Sophie yelled at the boys on the other side of the net, "Come on, your turn to serve." The boy who was supposed to serve hesitated. He just stood there with the ball in his hands. Sensing trouble, Jacob began to walk toward the volleyball court. Dressed in his pale-colored shirt, he didn't attract any attention from the boys, while the girls, including Sophie, had their backs towards him and couldn't see him. Something was about to go down. Episode 117, Tackling the Bullies. As Jacob was walking towards the scene, a basketball crashed onto the court, and the boys playing volleyball had to hurriedly dodge it. "Sorry, Soph, we're just here to pick up the basketball," one of the guys said to Sophie, who stared at the ground with rage. It was apparent that it was a scheme, since they were already walking towards the court before the basketball flew her way, but nobody dared to point it out. The boys were in the same year as Sophie, but in different classes. Like a lot of others, they had also tried their luck in asking her out, but Sophie had ignored all their attempts. However, unlike others, these boys were the ones who wouldn't give up, and had taken it on their ego now. Sophie stopped the basketball that was rolling her way by stepping on it with one foot. She then kicked the ball toward the guys and said, "Get out of here with your ball." Well, it looks like Soph is in a mood today." The guy with the slightly longer hair caught the ball before throwing it back to the basketball court that was in the distance with force, showing off his strength. Sophie just rolled her eyes and ignored him. "Does he think that's impressive? Any one of the elders around me could casually lift up a mountain," she thought. She turned to the boys in her class. "Let's continue with our match." The boy with the ball was a good student, but he was so timid that he didn't dare serve when he saw the bullies glaring at him. Other than Sophie, there were no tough figures in her class. She had always been the kind to not back down from a fight and was a natural leader among her classmates. However, those boys only got more encouraged when Sophie ignored them. They waved at the basketball court, and another basketball crashed towards the volleyball court, trying to mess up the volleyball match that Sophie's class was playing. Now, Sophie was pissed. She was about to explode when a palm appeared in the air and caught the basketball. Sophie turned and was surprised to see Jacob there. "I really thought bullying would be old-fashioned by now. Guess not." Jacob caught the ball and secured it between his two hands. "Who the hell are you?" The guy with long hair glared at Jacob, who had come from nowhere. They knew that Jacob wasn't a student there, but he didn't look old enough to be a teacher. Also, those boys felt a little intimidated by the way he caught the ball. "Go back to playing basketball and don't bother these students," Jacob said, ignoring the question. "Which school are you from? How did you get in here? Stay out of our business." The boys yelled one after another. Since Jacob was by himself, and there were several of them, they weren't going to admit defeat. Ignoring their taunting words, Jacob raised the basketball above his head, appearing as if he was going to shoot it. Looking at his standard shooting posture, Sophie's expression turned from astonishment to confusion. "What is he doing?" she wondered. The boys, and Sophie's classmates, all looked at Jacob as if he was crazy. "This guy's overconfident. There's no way he can make the shot from here. It's impossible," they thought. They still watched on as, with a flick of his wrists, the ball shot out of Jacob's palm. In a long arc, the ball shot towards the basketball hoop 50 meters away. Except for Sophie, everyone present was stunned. "Please don't miss. Please don't miss," Sophie prayed in her head. The basketball flew over a sideline of the soccer field, and some of the students who were playing soccer also looked up. As everybody had their eyes glued to the ball with bated breath, it went into the basket before dropping onto the ground. On the volleyball court, the bullies, who were standing beside Jacob, all gasped in astonishment. Sophie also looked at Jacob in astonishment. He not only had the strength to shoot the basketball into the court, but he also got the point. Her face immediately graced a big smile as she looked at Jacob, who was still watching the ball. "Your ball is back on the court. Why don't you go back and continue your game?" Jacob turned and said to the boys. Looking at Jacob uneasily, they found themselves unable to move their feet. Considering the matter finished, Sophie turned her full attention to Jacob. "Jacob, what are you doing here?" she asked. "I heard that some guys were harassing you, and I just came to have a look," Jacob answered. "He is so dashing. He must be very athletic." "Yeah, he has an elegant presence." "Yeah, he looks so composed." On the volleyball court, the girls in Sophie's class whispered to each other. Hearing their comments, Sophie's vanity was satisfied. With a pleasant smile, she tucked her hands under Jacob's arm and asked, "How did you get in here?" "I left my student ID card in the guard's office and he let me in," Jacob answered. Seeing Sophie holding Jacob's arm intimately, the other students were all stunned. "Sophie has a boyfriend? No wonder she doesn't look at anyone else. He's so cool," they thought. The boys exchanged looks with each other before slinking back to the basketball court. Seeing Sophie's classmates staring at him, Jacob was a bit uncomfortable. He lowered his head and asked, "Is it against school rules if we walk around the campus?" "No, it's not against the rules." Sophie shook her head, holding tightly onto Jacob's arm with a happy expression. "Let's go." Jacob led her out of the volleyball court, and Sophie caught up with him and put her hand in his palm. Jacob felt weird as he held onto her hand, as they had never acted like an actual couple before, let alone in front of her classmates. With her classmates' comments about her handsome and loving boyfriend still ringing in her ears, Sophie dragged Jacob out of that area into a quieter place. "What a surprise! Lunch is on me today," she said to Jacob excitedly. "What are we eating?" Jacob went along with her. "Something from the cafeteria," Sophie answered without thinking. The campus of her school was indeed beautiful. The trees lined the path. It looked more like a park than a school. Sunshine pierced through the leaves and fell softly on Jacob and Sophie's faces. "Is it okay for you to run out of the class and walk around campus?" Jacob asked her. "It's no big deal. I will go back before the class is finished," Sophie shrugged. "How long do you have before the end of the class?" Jacob asked. "I think 20 more minutes," Sophie answered, after thinking a little. Jacob remembered something and said, "The guard said that I could only stay in the school for 1 hour. I'm afraid I can't go to the cafeteria for lunch after your class." "He said that? You wait here." She ran to the gate of the school without any further explanation, leaving Jacob there to wait for her. A couple of minutes later, Sophie ran back with Jacob's student ID card in her hand. She tossed it at him and said, "Well, everything is set." "How did you get it?" Jacob asked. "There's nothing I can't get. I'm too sweet to say no to." Sophie looked at him with a huge smile to add effect. Jacob just rolled his eyes with a chuckle. "That she is," he thought. However, he still felt uneasy as an outsider loitering in their school. He was especially afraid of bumping into Sophie's class advisor. "I have to head back to class now. Till then, you can do whatever you want here." Sophie raised her head and said to Jacob. "Can I come with you?" Jacob asked. "I think my teacher will be back any moment. He won't allow you there." Sophie declined with a sad face. Then she added, Just wait for me. I'll come find you as soon as my class gets over. After saying that, she ran toward the sports field. Jacob, on the other hand, found a red pavilion nearby and walked over. After spotting a chair, he sat down on it and closed his eyes. Time passed without him noticing. Jacob had circulated the nature essence following the spirit concentration scroll about a dozen times, and someone tapped his shoulder lightly. "Hey, let's go eat lunch." Sophie had changed back into her usual school uniform. She looked at him with big, excited eyes, waiting for him to get up. Episode 118. Sophie's Trophy Boyfriend. Jacob stood up and followed Sophie out of the pavilion and towards the cafeteria. Sophie's class got off earlier as it was gym, so she led Jacob into the cafeteria when the line was still short, before the swarm of hungry students filled up the place. "Why don't you go and find seats over there?" Sophie pointed toward the seats near the window. Jacob walked to the area Sophie was pointing at and sat down to wait. He thought back to the day and wondered why he even came here when he knew he could get into trouble. He had really started to like the time Sophie and he spent together. He was lost in his own world when Sophie came back with 2 plates of food. At this moment, students began to pour into the cafeteria, and the lines suddenly got much longer. Since Jacob and Sophie got to the cafeteria several minutes earlier, they managed to avoid the long wait to have lunch together. Sophie was about to pick up her spoon and eat when a thought occurred to her. She picked up her plate and walked around the table to sit beside Jacob. "Oh, still need me as your shield?" Jacob teased. He knew she was trying to avoid any more boys troubling her. "Since you are here, I shall make it worth my while," Sophie told him, edging even closer to him. The students in the cafeteria all wore pale blue uniforms. Jacob, who didn't belong here, instantly stood out from the crowd. Before long, all the students had noticed the outsider who was sitting next to the most popular girl in the school. "Who's that guy? Do you know him? How come she suddenly has a boyfriend? Is he from another school? How'd he get in here? Which high school is he from?" Whispers were floating all around the cafeteria. Sophie's choice of seats that were against the window that offered everyone a clear view. They were sitting so close that Sophie's shoulder was touching his. "Hey, which high school did you go to?" she asked. Jacob was having a hard time concentrating on the question because of all the attention and the fact that he and Sophie were sitting so close for the first time. "Ridgewood High School," Jacob answered her. "Got it." Sophie nodded as she remembered the name to tell her friends later. She wanted to spread the word about her boyfriend far and wide. This might not end all her problems, but it will definitely reduce them. Suddenly, a thought occurred to her, and she said, excitedly, "Oh, I didn't know you were so good at basketball." "Actually, we have a basketball match next week, and I have been training every morning to play for it." Jacob turned to look at her and asked, "Do you want to come and watch? It's 7 in the evening next Thursday. It won't clash with your classes." "Of course, I'll be there," Sophie replied with a smile. "Do you think you'll be able to reach the stadium by yourself?" Jacob asked. "Since you wouldn't be able to pick me up, I'll get my dad and mom to watch it with me." Sophie thought for a while and answered. The way they were smiling at each other certainly got them more attention. The guys were filled with envy, while the girls were astonished at Soph's blatant show. Sophie was always the center of attention and was so bold that she even brought her boyfriend to school. Seeing the unfriendly glances cast this way, Jacob knew that they were Sophie's admirers, either publicly or secretly. "It seems I have a lot of competitors," Jacob thought. Seeing the rage in the guy's eyes, Sophie didn't want to cause any trouble for Jacob. She dragged him up and said, "We're done. Let's get out of here." During the lunch break, the area around the cafeteria was full of students, and some of the teachers also came there to eat. Not daring to cross the line, Sophie walked close to Jacob instead of holding his hand. In high school, walking together on the campus with their hands linked together was a very couple-like thing to do. The occasional touching of their hands tempted Jacob to hold her hand, but he was not bold enough to do so. After all, they were at her school. Sophie walked Jacob to the gate of the school, and he thought that she was saying it was time to leave. However, Sophie said, "It's still early. Walk with me to the shop near the school." Jacob and Sophie somehow managed to walk out with the flow of students. Once outside, Jacob heaved a sigh of relief as he was finally out of the territory of the school. Glancing at Sophie walking alongside him, Jacob reached out and grabbed her hand. It felt smooth and soft against his fingers. Surprised, she turned to look at Jacob, but she didn't shake his hand off. Instead, she smiled and dragged him to the small shop next to the school. In the gift shop, Sophie looked around at the decorative trinkets while holding Jacob's hand. "Soph, is he your boyfriend?" Some girls in the shop walked over and asked Sophie curiously. "Yeah." Sophie confirmed their conjecture. The girls took the opportunity to check Jacob out, looking at him from head to toe and finally at their tightly held hands. "Which year is he in? He isn't from our school, is he?" Another girl asked Sophie. "He's also in his senior year, and he's from Ridgewood High School," Sophie answered. It dawned on Jacob why Sophie had asked about which high school he went to. He was embarrassed to hear her call him a high school student. The girls once again turned their gaze to Jacob. Seeing his embarrassed expression, they teased, "Your boyfriend is quite shy." They thought Jacob was shy about being seen with his girlfriend. "He looks like a nerd. I'm surprised that you're into this type of guy." Another girl made a crude comment. "Yeah, he looks like such a good boy." Other girls agreed and giggled. "Well, stop gossiping. It's his first time at our school, and I'm going to show him around." Sophie waved them away. Moving forward, she continued into the depths of the shop. She told Jacob that she needed a new back cover for her phone and let go of Jacob's hand to browse the displayed items. "Which looks better, this one or that one?" Finally, she picked up 2 different covers and showed them to Jacob. "The left one." Jacob gave her his opinion. "Good, I'll take this one." Pleased, Sophie took the cover and led Jacob to the door of the shop. Jacob insisted and paid for her before they left the shop. Looking at Sophie, Jacob thought for a moment and asked, "Looks like you had fun today parading me around your school like a trophy boyfriend." "Trophy boyfriend?" Sophie raised her bright eyes and asked, "I didn't know you felt that way." No, I was just kidding. I know that you did what you needed to do," Jacob assured her. "Yeah, I really did need it," Sophie sighed. "It was kind of fun, though, acting like your boyfriend," Jacob teased her. Sophie blushed at this comment. She was about to tell him that her break was over, but then she suddenly remembered something. "Come closer," she ordered Jacob. "Why? Still not done with the parade?" Jacob joked. "No, I just remembered something," Sophie said, while pulling something out of her skirt pocket. Then she asked Jacob to turn around. He was confused, but went along with it. He could feel Sophie fiddling with the chain that Susan had given him. When she was finally done, Sophie asked him to turn back around and explained. "I attached a pendant to your necklace. My dad gave it to me. It could increase the cultivation speed by at least 10%. Since I have no use for it, you can take it." Jacob looked down and saw a thumb-sized, water-drop-shaped amber attached to his necklace, and he was grateful. "But wouldn't you need it?" he asked Sophie. "Not really. I think you can put it to better use," Sophie answered with a smile. Jacob smiled back at her and was about to say something when they saw students running back inside the school grounds, indicating that the break was over. "Okay, I have to go back now. It was great to see you today," Sophie said hurriedly and ran away towards the school. Jacob stood there looking at her go until she got lost in the sea of similar blue uniforms. Episode 119, Kathy's World. Jacob returned in time for his afternoon classes and met up with his friends. He somehow managed to get through the rest of the day without answering any of their questions. Everyone let out a sigh of relief as it was the weekend. Finally! Jacob's friends decided to go out to the nearest arcade to have some fun, but he still had to honor Kyle's invitation, so he stayed back and called Kathy. "My class is over. Where are you?" he asked. "I'm at the bus stop outside the north gate. Meet me here." Kathy's voice came from the phone. Picking up his wallet and cell phone, Jacob hurried towards the north gate of the school. Since it was Friday, the bus stop was filled with students who were going home for the weekend. Jacob reached out and looked for Kathy in the crowd. "Jacob! Jacob!" Kathy spotted him, jumped up, and beckoned him over to her. As he was being called over by a girl, Jacob found himself in the spotlight once again as students who were waiting in line all started looking at him. He forced himself to jog over to her. Standing at the end of the line, Kathy seemed to have just arrived at the stop. Jacob ran over and took her backpack from her. "It's fine, I can carry it," Kathy said, attempting to reclaim the backpack. "It's heavy, and we have to wait for a while before the bus comes. Let me carry it for you," Jacob said, being chivalrous. Kathy gave up and thanked him. She had watched Jacob rock climb and knew that under his ordinary veneer, his strength was extraordinary. The line moved forward slowly as the buses came one by one and picked up the students. Jacob weighed the bag on his back and asked, "Kathy, what's in your bag? It's quite heavy." "Books," she answered simply. "Oh." Jacob didn't pursue the subject because he knew Kathy was sensitive about her books. "Jacob, you must be smart. I don't see you studying that hard, but you have passed all the exams," Kathy said suddenly. "All of my friends are like this. We usually cram for the exams," Jacob answered casually, and regretted saying that almost immediately. He knew that it was stupid to boast about their bad habits in front of Kathy, so he tried to change the topic. "So, you study really hard. Do you have any specific goals?" "I have no specific goal except not wanting to be left behind," Kathy said. Another bus entered the stop, and the line moved forward, but at a snail's pace. Jacob and Kathy boarded this bus and sat next to each other. As the bus started moving, Kathy turned to look out the window. "Kathy, which high school did you attend?" Jacob asked inquisitively. "Cherry Grove High. It's not far from our university." Kathy then turned to look at Jacob and asked, "Which school did you go to?" Kathy went to the same school as Sophie, Jacob thought as he was in shock. He answered her question nonetheless. "I went to Ridgewood High." "That's a good school," Kathy replied. "Yours is actually quite posh, isn't it? Did you directly go to their high school, or did you attend middle school there as well?" Jacob continued to ask. "No, I was in their middle school too," she answered. "Oh, okay." Jacob didn't know what else to say. "Now that you mentioned it, the girl who came to watch you race in the athletic games is also from Cherry Grove High, right? I just recalled that she was in our school uniform," Kathy said. "Yeah, I'm tutoring her," Jacob said. "When I was in that school, many students came from rich and influential families, and I think the situation remains the same. No wonder they sent a car to pick you up for the tutoring sessions," Kathy said with a sigh. Jacob thought of her simple clothes and her used bike and felt like she must have come from a middle-class family and entered Cherry Grove High on the basis of her excellent grades. Jacob felt the need to keep the conversation going and asked, "Kathy, do you think I look like a high school student?" Baffled by the question, Kathy leaned to the side and looked him up and down. "I guess so. High school students nowadays are quite mature-looking, and I think you could pass as one of them," she said. "Oh." Jacob was relieved and at the same time a bit smug. "I can still pass as a high school student," he thought. "I've never returned to my high school since graduation. Sometimes I really want to go back and have a look at it," Kathy said, feeling nostalgic. Seeing the reminiscence in her eyes, Jacob wondered if she had had a boyfriend in school. "Kathy, I guess you must have been one of the top students in the school, right?" Seeing Kathy getting lost in her memories, Jacob couldn't help asking. "Not at all. Many of them were better than me. In fact, a few got into Ivy League colleges," Kathy corrected him immediately. "With a face as pretty as yours," Jacob glanced at her before continuing to ask, "you must have been the most popular girl in the school, right?" "Well," Kathy smiled as she lowered her head. Then she looked out of the window. Jacob couldn't tell whether she was feeling bored with the topic or showing her indifference to it. The rickety bus reached another stop and more people got on, making the bus even more crowded. The bus continued forward. Jacob was about to doze off when Kathy woke him with a touch on the shoulder. "We are here. Let's get off the bus," she said. Jacob stood up in a hurry and took Kathy's backpack from her hands and headed toward the rear end of the bus. Kathy followed Jacob closely while resting her palm lightly against his back, giving herself leverage in the crowded bus. After climbing off the bus, Kathy took her backpack from Jacob and insisted on carrying it herself. Jacob looked around and found that they were in an area lined with old buildings. Some of them looked too old to even be standing, and the area didn't look very lively. "Is this where Kathy lives?" Jacob was a little surprised. "I need to buy some groceries." Oblivious to his surprise, Kathy led Jacob toward a small market. The cluttered market was a temporary one on a narrow street between two rows of shacks. Carrying her backpack on her back, Kathy chose some vegetables and bought a packed meal. Jacob's heart ached for Kathy, walking around in the dark and muddy temporary food market. Obviously, Kathy knew how to keep a home running, though her style was quite different from Helen's. With the boxed meal and vegetables in her hands, Kathy led Jacob out of the messy food market and toward a small house. Now, Jacob felt not only sorry for her, but astonished as well. Kathy walked to a weathered wooden door and knocked. "Grandma!" she yelled. The door opened and an elderly lady stood before them. Her legs were shaking as she stood there. "Grandma, I bought this for you. Eat it while it's still warm," Kathy said, placing the packed meal into her hands before massaging the elderly woman's wrinkly hands. "I'm busy today, so I will come talk to you tomorrow," she said. The old lady nodded shakily. Seeing Jacob standing by Kathy, she smiled happily and held up her thumb. Kathy blushed and murmured, "Grandma, it's not what you think." She helped the old lady into the room, and she soon came back and beckoned to Jacob. "Let's go," she said. "She is..." Jacob asked in bafflement. "She can't speak. Her son works away from the city and comes back rarely. She lives alone, and each time I come home, I buy her some food on the way." Their view suddenly opened up after they walked out of the narrow shanty zone. Glancing at Kathy, who was walking beside him in the sunshine, Jacob suddenly realized what an amazing person she was. The respect he had in his heart for her had just increased manifold. Episode 120, Kyle and Kathy. Kathy and Jacob were walking shoulder to shoulder, with her carrying the groceries and him carrying her backpack. The streetlights lit up the path that they continued on silently. The walk was relaxing for Jacob, and the soft sunlight added to the experience. Walking into an old neighborhood, Kathy led him to a dusty building after making a lot of turns on narrow roads. After they climbed to the third floor, Kathy smacked a dark security door. "Kyle, I'm back! Open the door!" The shabby security door was pulled open forcibly. Kyle, who was in a simple shirt, stood behind it. Looking from the doorway, the apartment seemed quite tidy, with very basic decorations. Jacob didn't really know what he had expected Kathy's home to look like, but this wasn't it. "Come in." Kyle made way for them to enter the narrow doorway. He simply nodded at Jacob in acknowledgement, and Jacob nodded back awkwardly. "I bought some vegetables and some groceries too," Kathy said, putting down the plastic bags on the table. "You don't have to tell me that." Kyle waved his hand impatiently. "Why not? After all, you're the one who's going to use them tonight when you cook dinner." Kathy rolled her eyes at Kyle. "Why would I cook dinner? It's your turn." Kyle frowned. Seeing the siblings arguing, Jacob had no chance to get a word in. Therefore, he went to find a spot to sit down. Fine, I'll cook today." Kyle lost the argument with his sister eventually, so he picked up the plastic bags and walked into the greasy kitchen. It was a little weird for Jacob to be in their home. Seeing them fighting about petty things like that felt too intimate. Kyle was dressed in plain clothes as opposed to how he dressed up for college. He was the basketball captain after all. Kathy noticed Jacob's expression and realized that he was feeling out of place, so she immediately tried to engage him. "Have a seat." Kathy pulled out a chair and went inside to make him some tea. Jacob smiled as he accepted the tea from her. He was so used to seeing Kathy, who was always thinking about her studies and was the president of their class. However, the person he saw at the moment was Kathy living her real life. "Okay, take him to your room to rest. I'm going to cook now, and it will be too smoky and greasy," Kyle yelled from the kitchen. In an old apartment like theirs, the kitchen was an area without a door to separate it from other rooms. As a consequence, part of the cooking smoke would flow into the living room. However, it would be too hot in the kitchen if a door was built. Kathy felt a bit upset at her brother for asking someone to go into her bedroom casually. However, she didn't want to bring Jacob to Kyle's messy bedroom either, so she pulled Jacob up by his sleeve and said, "It's greasy out here. Come to my room." Without getting the time to express his surprise at being asked into her room, Jacob was pulled into her bedroom. If anyone from his dorm heard about it, they probably won't even believe him. There were some old posters on the wall, and the quilt on the bed was folded nicely. However, there was a string hanging from the room, on which were Kathy's pictures, lots of them. He turned towards that wall to get a better look at them, while Kathy blushed as she saw him looking at her embarrassing pictures. On that string, there were recent pictures, as well as old ones, and Kathy was in every one of them. They were hung on the string with little clips that added a personal touch to the otherwise plain room. Jacob went through the pictures successively. He saw Kathy in middle school and then high school, and also saw some faded old pictures of her when she was in elementary school. He smiled as he saw a baby picture of her. She looked extremely cute in a princess dress and tiara. As for Kathy, she slowly walked towards him while still blushing. "They are just pictures of my childhood, nothing interesting," she tried to explain. Staring at the pictures, Jacob noticed that the one thing a lot of them had in common was that they were taken on the beach, with her either swimming or playing in the water. So he asked, "You like the sea too?" "Yes, I went to the seaside a lot when I was a kid," Kathy answered as she stood beside Jacob and also looked at the pictures. I guess everyone loved to go to the beach when they were a kid if they were born around as many beaches as we are, she said with nostalgia. Sensing the shyness in Kathy's voice, Jacob stopped looking at her childhood pictures. He turned his face toward her and asked, "Is it just you and Kyle here?" "And also my aunt and uncle, Kyle's parents. They aren't here today as they went out for dinner and will be back late," Kathy said. "So Kyle is your cousin?" Jacob asked for clarity. "Yes," Kathy nodded. "My parents had to leave the city for work when I was 10. They couldn't take me along, so they left me here with Kyle's parents. I was planning on moving out of here after I got into college, but my aunt insisted that I stay with them till I'm in the state." Jacob nodded and thought to himself, no wonder Kyle and Kathy are so different from each other, but they are also so close to each other as if they are real siblings. "I like to call him my brother since we have grown up like siblings," said Kathy, confirming his thoughts. "But he has rarely lived here since high school. He went to a full-time boarding school and only came back on weekends once in a while. Not to mention, when he went to university and rented his own place, he rarely came back home. He had to go to the stadium for training." "Oh, he is really invested in basketball, isn't he?" Jacob lowered his voice and asked, "Is he, terrible at academics, so playing basketball is his only choice for a career?" Kathy shook her head unexpectedly and replied, "Actually, Kyle is doing excellent at college. Even now, he is one of the toppers in his senior year. He is smart, or I should say that he is even smarter than me. If I'm confused about any questions, he is the one who helps me out." Jacob was surprised at her response. He didn't expect that the uncivilized-looking Kyle, who was incredibly good at basketball, was also excellent at school, as well as knew how to cook. No doubt Kyle is so popular among the ladies, even with his rude behavior, he thought. "I know my brother plays basketball all the time, but he has already received an offer with a full scholarship from Stanford University. He will go there for his post-graduation once he finishes college here," Kathy said. Jacob opened his mouth subconsciously. Kyle really was incredible. Time passed as Jacob and Kathy chatted about random things. Jacob learned a lot of facts about the siblings, who seemed to be excelling in all the avenues they pursued. He was inspired and intimidated by them at the same time. They didn't even realize how much time had passed. "Kay, come out for dinner. I've made a few dishes for us," Kyle yelled from the kitchen. Kyle's call made them realize that it had been a long time since Kyle had started cooking. "Let's go." Kathy walked out with Jacob. As soon as Jacob walked out of Kathy's bedroom, he saw a couple of plates of delicious-smelling food placed neatly on the black table. When he turned to look at the hefty man, Kyle, there was already something different in the way he looked at him. Kyle had cooked and set the table for them, just like Helen did when he ate at Sophie's house. The thought of comparing Kyle to the sweet and, of course, much shorter Helen was comedic to Jacob, and he somehow controlled it from showing on his face. He respected Kyle and was also scared of him. Offending him in his own home was the last thing that Jacob wanted to do.